Lesson 7, page 46. Questions and answers. Listen to these questions and answers. Repeat the questions, then repeat the answers.
One. What's that?
It's a letter from Tom.
Who's Tom?
He's my brother.
Two. What are those?
They're birthday cards. They're from Irene and Jane.
Who are Irene and Jane?
They're my neighbors.
Three. What's that?
It's a picture of Mr. Chang.
Who's Mr. Chang?
He's president of Orient Airlines.
Four. What's that?
It's a gift from Kathy.
Who's Kathy?
She's my little sister.
Now, repeat the questions.
1. What's that? What's that? Who's Tom? Who's Tom? 2. What are those? What are those? Who are Irene and Jane? Who are Irene and Jane? 3. What's that? What's that? Who's Mr. Chang? Who's Mr. Chang? 4. What's that? What's that? Who's Kathy? Who's Kathy?
Now, listen to the questions and repeat the answers.
1. What's that?
It's a letter from Tom. It's a letter from Tom.
Who's Tom?
He's my brother. He's my brother.
2. What are those?
They're birthday cards. They're from Irene and Jane. They're birthday cards. They're from Irene and Jane.
Who are Irene and Jane?
They're my neighbors. They're my neighbors.
3. What's that?
It's a picture of Mr. Chang. It's a picture of Mr. Chang.
Who's Mr. Chang?
He's president of Orient Airlines. He's president of Orient Airlines.
4. What's that?
It's a gift from Kathy. It's a gift from Kathy.
Who's Kathy?
She's my little sister. She's my little sister.
Practice drills and exercises. 1. 1. Identifying things. Question word, WH. Questions with what? Repeat the questions after speaker A.
1. That's a map.
What's that?
It's a map. 2. This is a letter from Tom.
What's this?
It's a letter from Tom. 3. These are pictures.
What are these?
They're pictures. 4. Those are textbooks.
What are those?
They're textbooks.
Take the part of Speaker A. Form WH questions. Listen to the model.
1. That's a business letter.
What's that?
It's a business letter.
Now do the exercise.
1. That's a business letter. It's a business letter. 2. Those are maps. They're maps. 3. This is a new book. It's a new book. 4. Those are tables. They're tables.
Take the part of Speaker B. Begin your answer with its or their. Listen to the model.
1. This is a cassette.
What's this?
It's a cassette.
Now do the exercise.
1. This is a cassette.
What's this?
2. These are tapes.
What are these?
3. That's a tape recorder.
What's that?
4. Those are pens.
What are those?
2. Identifying people. Question word WH. Questions with who. Form questions using who. Listen to the models. 1. That's my brother.
Who's that?
That's my brother. 2. Those men are Jim and Bill.
Who are those men?
They're Jim and Bill. Now do the exercise. 1. That's my brother.
Who's that?
That's my brother. 2. Those men are Jim and Bill.
Who are those men?
They're Jim and Bill. 3. Kathy's my little sister.
Who's Kathy?
She's my little sister. 4. That man's Dr. Black.
Who's that man?
That's Dr. Black. 5. Jane's his daughter.
Who's Jane?
She's his daughter. 6. That woman is Mrs. Carlson.
Who's that woman?
It's Mrs. Carlson. 7. That little boy is Tom.
Who's that little boy?
It's Tom. 8. That's Mr. Smith.
Who's that?
It's Mr. Smith.
3. Identifying people. Question word WH questions with who. Complete the sentences. Take the part of Speaker A. Listen to the models.
1. That's my sister.
Who's that?
Who's that?
Who's that?
That's my sister. 2. That little girl is Jane.
Who's that little girl?
Who's that little girl?
Who's that little girl?
That's Jane.
Now do the exercise.
1. That's my sister.
Who's that?
That's my sister. 2. That little girl is Jane.
Who's that little girl?
That's Jane. 3. Those men are Tom and Fred.
Who are those men?
They're Tom and Fred. 4. Bill's his son.
Who's Bill?
He's his son. 5. That nurse is Miss Black.
Who's that nurse?
That's Miss Black. 6. That boy over there is Bob.
Who's that boy over there?
That's Bob. 7. That man's her husband.
Who's that man?
It's her husband. 8. Those people are visitors.
Who are those people?
They're visitors. 9. Jimmy's my little brother.
Who's Jimmy?
He's my little brother. 10. Those men are visitors.
Who are those men?
They're visitors. 11. This girl is my daughter.
Who is this girl?
This is my daughter. 12. Those boys are my brothers.
Who are those boys?
They're my brothers. 13. That lady is Mrs. Carlson.
Who is that lady?
That's Mrs. Carlson.
Dialogue. Visiting. Mrs. Lane and Mrs. Carlson are still at Mrs. Watson's house. Mrs. Watson and Mrs. Carlson are talking.
What does your husband do?
He's a chemist.
Is he at the university?
No, he isn't. He's with the Lamar Lumber Company.
Oh, my uncle's an accountant there. It's a very big company.
Yes, it certainly is. Is your husband a professor?
No, he's with the government. He's a biologist.
Now repeat.
What does your husband do? What does your husband do?
He's a chemist. He's a chemist.
Is he at the university? Is he at the university?
No, he isn't. He's with the Lamar Lumber Company. No, he isn't. He's with the Lamar Lumber Company.
Oh, my uncle's an accountant there. It's a very big company. Oh, my uncle's an accountant there. It's a very big company.
Yes, it certainly is. Is your husband a professor? Yes, it certainly is. Is your husband a professor?
No, he's with the government. He's a biologist. No, he's with the government. He's a biologist.
Now listen again.
What does your husband do?
He's a chemist.
Is he at the university?
No, he isn't. He's with the Lamar Lumber Company.
Oh, my uncle's an accountant there. It's a very big company.
Yes, it certainly is. Is your husband a professor?
No, he's with the government. He's a biologist.
Practice drills and exercises. 2. 1. Asking about occupations. What's his occupation is the same as what is he or what does he do? Substitute the occupations. Use he or she as appropriate.
Repeat, please.
1. What's his occupation?
He's an accountant.
2. What's her occupation?
She's a nurse.
3. What is Tom?
He's an engineer.
4. What is Mrs. Larson?
She's a professor.
5. What is Mr. Jones?
He's a lawyer.
6. What's Mr. Carlson?
He's a chemist.
7. What's her occupation?
She's a biologist.
8. What's Miss Long?
She's a typist.
Substitute the occupations. Use he or she as appropriate.
1. What's his occupation? An accountant.
He's an accountant.
2. What's her occupation? A nurse.
She's a nurse.
3. What is Tom? An engineer.
He's an engineer.
4. What is Mrs. Larson? A professor.
She's a professor.
5. What is Mr. Jones? A lawyer.
He's a lawyer.
6. What's Mr. Carlson? A chemist.
He's a chemist.
7. What's her occupation? A biologist.
She's a biologist.
8. What's Miss Long? A typist.
She's a typist.
Page 50.
Listen to these conversational exchanges.
What does Mr. Smith do?
He's a lawyer.
What's your occupation?
I'm a professor.
What's Mr. Watson?
He's a biologist.
What do Fred and Tom do?
They're lawyers.
Mr. Watson isn't a lawyer.
What is he?
He's a scientist. Miss Long isn't a secretary.
What is she?
She's a typist. I'm not a doctor.
What are you?
I'm a professor.
Now repeat, please.
1. What does Mr. Smith do? What does Mr. Smith do?
He's a lawyer. He's a lawyer.
2. What's your occupation? What's your occupation?
I'm a professor. I'm a professor.
3. What's Mr. Watson? What's Mr. Watson?
He's a biologist. He's a biologist.
4. What do Fred and Tom do? What do Fred and Tom do?
They're lawyers. They're lawyers.
5. Mr. Watson isn't a lawyer. Mr. Watson isn't a lawyer.
What is he? What is he?
He's a scientist. He's a scientist. 6. Miss Long isn't a secretary. Miss Long isn't a secretary.
What is she? What is she?
She's a typist. She's a typist. 7. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a doctor.
What are you? What are you?
I'm a professor. I'm a professor. Repeat the questions. 1. What do you do? What do you do?
I'm a lawyer.
2. What do you do? What do you do?
I'm a biologist.
3. And what do you do? And what do you do?
I'm a chemist.
4. Mr. Smith, what do you do? Mr. Smith, what do you do?
I'm a doctor.
2. Asking about occupations. Take the part of the student. Listen to the models.
1. What does Mr. Watson do? Biologist.
He's a biologist.
2. What's Miss Green? Secretary.
She's a secretary.
3. What's your occupation? Professor.
I'm a professor. Now you do the exercise.
1. What does Mr. Watson do? Biologist.
He's a biologist. He's a biologist.
2. What's Miss Green? Secretary.
She's a secretary. She's a secretary.
3. What's your occupation? Professor.
I'm a professor. I'm a professor.
4. What's my occupation? Teacher.
You're a teacher. You're a teacher.
5. What does Mr. Smith do? Lawyer.
He's a lawyer. He's a lawyer.
6. What are Jim and Ted? Students.
They're students. They're students.
7. What are you? Professor.
I'm a professor. I'm a professor.
8. What's Mr. Jones? Engineer.
He's an engineer. He's an engineer.
9. What does Miss Platt do? Artist.
She's an artist. She's an artist.
10. What do Miss Long and Mrs. Black do? Typists.
They're typists. They're typists.
11. What's Dr. Morton? Law professor.
He's a law professor. He's a law professor.
12. What's his occupation? Accountant.
He's an accountant. He's an accountant.
3. Alternative questions with or. Listen.
Is she a lawyer or a doctor? Is that Mr. Jones or Mr. Woods? Is her first name Mary or Irene?
Now repeat, please.
Is she a lawyer or a doctor? Is she a lawyer or a doctor? Is that Mr. Jones or Mr. Woods? Is that Mr. Jones or Mr. Woods? Is her first name Mary or Irene? Is her first name Mary or Irene?
End of Lesson 7.